In 1961, journalist John Howard Griffin had his book published, Black Like Me. It was his personal account of being a black man in the U.S. Deep South during a time of racial segregation. John Howard Griffin was white. I'm Larry Fedoruk, and this is Later That Same Life. Each week on my podcast, a different topic, discussion, or story from our lives.
Season 12, Chapter 12.
Black Like Me.
I read the book Black Like Me about a decade after it came out. It was part of an assignment given to those of us then enrolled in a liberal indoctrination program. Well, back then we called it high school. As we now know, because of the enlightened, socially insensitive MAGA conservatives, education is no longer education. It's indoctrination. Perhaps this is why many of them avoid being educated. God forbid they should learn something that might change their mind. From the time that the book came out to the time that we were assigned Black Like Me as an English literature high school book report project, a lot had changed in America when it came to race. A lot also remained the same, but here's what had happened. 1961, Black Like Me, published. Months later, the Black Panther Party was formed in Oakland, California, not as a direct result. It was just part of the overall. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy, in a famous speech, declared civil rights a moral, constitutional, and legal crisis. That summer, he nationalized the Alabama National Guard to allow for desegregation of schools, directly challenging then-Governor George Wallace. Months later, Martin Luther King Jr. led the March on Washington for jobs and freedom. In the spring of '64, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. That prohibited discrimination based on race or color, among other things. There were the Detroit race riots in 1967, the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in April of 1968. All of this and more brought directly into our living rooms on a nightly basis by the burgeoning industry known as television news. Brought to you by Chevrolet, Coca-Cola, and Chesterfields. Made from 21 vintage tobaccos, the cigarette too good to filter.
21 great tobaccos make 20 wonderful smokes.
The wonderful taste of Chesterfield King. Pleasure too good to miss.
All of these events and the information created a new mood. And it was in that mood that a couple of dozen white Catholic Canadian high school students were handed well-worn paperback copies of a book called Black Like Me. Book report presentations in front of the English Lit class will begin in 2 weeks. Copies of the book report will then be left with Mr. Hackle for grading purposes. Marks will count for 10% of your final grade in this class. At this point in my high school life, I considered myself the king of the fake book report, i.e., the ability to get a passing grade on a book report about a book you had never read. I love reading now, but this was high school. What was so distasteful about having to read a book? Was it that it was mandated? You were being told what to do? It wasn't reading itself. At the time, I could spend an entire evening in my room reading from cover to cover 6 Mad magazines, 3 issues of Cracked, and 14 Archie comics. But a book? Ew, a book. This was also a time before the proliferation and ease of access to Coles Notes. Coles Notes. Canadians know what I'm talking about, right? Coles bookstores published these short synopses on a variety of topics, including certain books, like an early print version of Wikipedia. I'll tell you, if somebody could get a hold of a Coles Notes on a subject on which a high school report was due, that thing was gold. It got around. Hey, can I borrow your Coles Notes? I'll give you $1. At least with the Coles Notes, you had a solid foundation on which you could fake a book report. I know what you're saying. All that time and effort to BS a book report? Would not have it been much simpler just to read the book? Well, yeah, but where's the fun in that? Who Has Seen the Wind by W.O. Mitchell, a book report by Larry Fedoruk. Who Has Seen the Wind, a book by W.O. Mitchell. W.O. stands for William Ormond. William starts with the W, as do the words who and wind. Coincidence? I don't think so. Who has seen the wind? Well, I don't want to give away the ending, but a great question. Who has seen the wind? Who has heard the sun? Who has tasted the snow? And as author Creedence Clearwater once asked, who'll stop the rain? The entire point of the book can be found on page 162. That would be the only page I actually read. When young Brian goes outside and it is windy. Well, there's more, but point is I got a B-. To this day, I've never read that book. Why would I? B-. That's on my permanent record. I actually had good marks in high school, but I'm still proudest of the average grades I got out of the fake book reports. You know, the A in algebra has never served me as well as the creativity applied to falsifying W.O. Mitchell. The book Black Like Me was different. I was going to read this one, read the whole thing. I was going to make notes, write an actual book report. I would do way better than a B-. Why? What had changed? Was I becoming more socially conscious, more aware of the injustices of racism, unfairness in society, the plight of people of color? Yes, that was absolutely partially true. No, really, there was that. But actually, my main motivation was Molly Mars. Is that about the greatest name you've ever heard, or what? Molly Mars was this hippie chick I had a crazy crush on. She was my lab partner in biology class and sat across from me in English Lit. The day we got our Black Like Me assignment, she went on this whole speech about the book, about racial inequality, how we were the generation of change. She owned 6 Bob Dylan albums. Her cousin had been at Woodstock. If I had any chance at all of going on a date with Molly Mars, I had to show a similar exuberance for an end to racial discrimination. I couldn't fake this one. I could talk the talk, but I also had to read the book. I think today I have heightened racial and social consciousness. I act as an ally wherever I can, but I have to admit, it was partially born out of a teenage crush, heightened awareness as a result of horniness, heedful because of hormones. All right, Black Like Me, the book. A white journalist goes undercover to experience and write about being black in the deep South USA. Gee, I guess they couldn't find an actual black man who could chronicle his real life, at least not one who could get published. What was John Howard Griffin's motivation? Well, he was a journalist of good conscience. This was a story that needed covering, perhaps by a white ally, who in the day might be more widely read than his black counterpart. At least a year before, in her book To Kill a Mockingbird, by the way, the only other book I read all the way through in high school, author Harper Lee has her main protagonist, attorney Atticus Finch, say, "You never really understand a man until you discover things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it." Maybe that was the only way to get this done in 1961. Climb into his skin. I mean, it is one thing to hear someone's story, and understand it, but it's another to try and really imagine what that would be like. That's called empathy. John Howard Griffin was born in 1920 near Dallas, Texas. Previous to the monster success of Black Like Me, he was already a published author, war hero, and by the way, in 1952 converted to Catholicism. Later, he received a special dispensation from the Vatican to allow his second marriage. And after Black Like Me, received special Catholic Church awards for furthering the cause of racial equality. All this by the way of explaining how this book may have ended up on the curriculum of a Catholic high school years later. Griffin began his Black Like Me project in 1959. He spent weeks at a friend's house taking large doses of a skin-darkening serum. He spent hours a day under a sun lamp. He shaved his head, straight brown hair, to further the disguise. It was agreed that during his sojourn, he would speak as little as possible, rather than try to affect some African-American dialect or accent. He traveled with a white photographer, Don Rutledge. The Black Like Me project was being underwritten by Sepia Magazine, a photojournalistic monthly founded just after World War II to highlight achievements of African Americans. It predated Ebony magazine by almost a decade, although fell well behind it in circulation until Sepia's final publication in the early 1980s. Sepia magazine funded Griffin's idea in exchange for first publication rights to Griffin's diary of his experiences, plus Rutledge's photos. All the articles published appeared under the banner Journey to Shame. He began in New Orleans, a city he knew well. He got a job as a shoeshine boy. And then they traveled the southern U.S., including Mississippi, Arkansas, Georgia, Alabama, side trips to South Carolina. He wrote about getting a seat on a bus, giving up his seat to a white woman, getting looks of approval from other white people, looks of disdain from black passengers. He wrote about his interactions with black and white Americans at lunch counters, bathrooms, hotels, and more. After about 6 weeks, his skin beginning to lighten, Griffin spent several days in a hotel room without sunlight in Montgomery, Alabama. Looking more like the white John Howard Griffin, he walked out into the street and later wrote about being amazed how easily and warmly he was suddenly able to walk about in white society. In 1961, Griffin added some further notes to the series of articles, and it was all published in book form, Black Like Me. It became a crucial part of the civil rights discussion. In his Texas hometown, his family received death threats, and a likeness of the author was hung and burned in effigy. In 1975, Griffin survived a beating by the Ku Klux Klan. He also received a lot of support for his efforts. In 1964, a movie of the same name was released. Griffin helped co-write the screenplay. Respected actor James Whitmore played him in the film, which also starred Roscoe Lee Brown, one of the early African-American actors who openly advocated for equality. The movie did not do as well as the book. And if you're thinking, why didn't I just watch the movie a la George Costanza and Breakfast at Tiffany's? Well, I did have that Molly Mars motivation, and we didn't have Blockbuster yet. I read the book, and I loved it, and it changed me as a person. Not to mention, the book report got an A. John Howard Griffin continued to be an ally, continued to write, often adding content and essays to anniversary editions of Black Like Me. He died in the fall of 1980 from complications due to his diabetes. There was, and I guess still is, a popular myth that Griffin had died from skin cancer caused by the darkening drug he had taken all those years ago. While it's true that he did at times suffer from some of the side effects of the drug, like fatigue and nausea, he never had skin cancer. Died from complications from diabetes. In 2011, a special 50th anniversary of Black Like Me was published, which also included some of Griffin's other works. An associate of Griffin's, Robert Bonazzi, published a memoir of Griffin, Man in the Mirror, John Howard Griffin and the Story of Black Like Me, and years later another Bonazzi work, Reluctant Activist, The Spiritual Life and Arts of John Howard Griffin. Uncommon Vision, The Life and Times of John Howard Griffin, is a 2011 documentary. It's available on DVD and some streaming services. In the documentary, black activists like Dick Gregory show respect for what Griffin did. They point out that a young black person, especially in the American South, didn't take on the mantle of blackness. They were born to it. Racism was automatically thrust upon them. Griffin was white. He didn't have to take it on, but he did. He did it to shed light on the issue. Griffin helped say that this wasn't a black problem. It was an American problem. The publication and notoriety of Black Like Me, I don't think was necessarily a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement, not like, for example, the March on Washington. But it is an important chapter in the story, and somewhat forgotten. As I alluded to earlier, it helped bring the racial issues to a wider segment of society, including far, far away to a small Catholic high school on the Great Canadian Prairie. Interesting that today something like this would never happen. The idea wouldn't make it out of the boardroom. Heck, I think no one would even want to ever bring it up. Hey, how about this? White guy disguised as a black guy and writes about it for a black magazine. No, next. Seems so bizarre by today's standards and, without the background, which I hope I have helped provide. Griffin saw injustice and wanted to do something about it. That is noble. He was reminded of the injustice he saw against Jews when he lived in Europe. War injuries combined with his diabetes caused him to be almost completely blind for a time. He learned then that he had to see people for what they are, not for the color of their skin. As his vision returned, he never forgot those lessons learned. I have another term for racial inequality. I also call it facial inequality. The number of judgments we make instantly and biases we hold just by seeing someone's face, color included. 1961, Black Like Me, from a different time. And what about today? Are things better or just not as bad as they were? Because those are actually two different things.
Now, you wrote your book when you assumed the coloration of a black person. This was almost 9 years ago, I believe. Now, if you wrote it again, would you find the same discrimination?
You would find great differences. It's easier to get water and food, and it's easier to do. The physical things have been improved, but the essential discrimination where you just stand there and you're viewed as an intrinsically other and different kind of human being, whether you've got degrees or whether you haven't, this is not altered. It's this fundamental core issue that so afflicts black people today.
By the way, my experience with that book back in high school, the story of it, just came to me one day out of the clear blue. Did you ever have one of those? Something pops into your mind for no apparent reason whatsoever? Nothing that you saw, heard, or did seemed to trigger the thought. Instead, it's like someone or something just thrust it into your head. I get those all the time. I value them highly. I mean, I'm not really a mystical guy, but I do always think that someone must have sent me this for a reason, and it's up to me to figure out what that reason is. In this case, I think just to share the story. I love them. It's great. It's like getting an unexpected call from an old friend you haven't heard from for a long time. That's what memories are, at least the good ones. They are old friends, and they can visit any time, even uninvited. Which reminds me, 25th high school reunion. Molly Mars was there. I was single. She was single. We went on a date. High school dreams, they can come true, even if it's a long time after high school. She now owns even more Dylan albums.
Later That Same Life is written, voiced, and produced by Larry Fedoruk. LarryFedoruk37@gmail.com. Subscribe to Larry's podcast YouTube channel. Get automatic notifications with each new episode.